This is 2 Minutes Together, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. I'm Pastor Ben. This week, in all of our readings, we have an emphasis on forgiveness. And one of the readings is our Old Testament reading, where we have Genesis, the very end of the book of Genesis, where Joseph says to his brothers, those who sold him into slavery, "What you intended for evil, God has done for good." And it is a message of forgiveness. I want to spend a few minutes thinking about that story, very noted story. But one thing that the book of Genesis doesn't do for us is provide the inner thoughts or inner working of anyone, any characters. We don't know, for example, how in the early part of Genesis Abraham felt when he was told to leave his homeland and go to this land of Canaan. We don't know how he felt when he was supposed to take Isaac up on the mountain to sacrifice. We don't have any of that information, and so there is an ancient practice called exegetical imagination, or how we have to supply some of the imaginative ideas behind this. And we have to do that. That's what we do when we read it. But I do think we need to be cautious sometimes. In the Joseph narrative, there's a lot of things we can imagine about how he forgives his brothers who sold him into slavery, which was a only slightly nuanced thing of what they really wanted to do, which was to kill him. Well, we could sometimes read that and think, well, how did Joseph do that? And are we supposed to do likewise? But what it doesn't tell us is how and when Joseph was there able to do that forgiveness. Joseph meets his brothers years after they sold him into slavery, where Joseph became a slave and eventually was in prison. And then, through the radical action of God, the book of Genesis tells us, Joseph eventually becomes second in command of all of Egypt and is an incredibly powerful person who has wealth and luxury like they never had before. And it is only then that Joseph is able to say, "What you intended for evil, God intended for good." He didn't say that at the beginning, or at least we don't know that he did. And of course, we could have said most anything and we don't know, but the point I'd like to focus on is we should be very cautious with our own imagination. That we seem to think that Joseph, being such an incredibly virtuous person, is able to forgive his brothers as soon as they do this. But of course, that's not the story. He forgives his brothers only after it has worked out for him. And not just worked out, but worked out incredibly well for him. This is just a moment for us to recognize in our own lives when we are dealing with questions of forgiveness between one another. It's not always as simple as simply a wrong is done to you and immediately you can forgive it. Joseph, we don't know that process, but we do know that when he finally did it was years later. This is 2 Minutes Together. I'm Pastor Ben.